You think you're choosing, but something else is choosing for you, and it's not a person. He always believed he was making conscious decisions, weighing options, thinking rationally, taking responsibility. But something cracked in that belief the moment he noticed a strange repetition. The same reactions in different situations, the same words coming out without thought, the same instinct to stay silent when something inside screamed to speak. He wasn't planning to say yes, but he did. He didn't want to react, but he reacted anyway. And then the question appeared, who inside me acts before I even have time to think? Jung believed the unconscious is not a shadow lurking beneath. It is the foundational structure of the self. It acts not after, but before the mind catches up. It carries memory, fear, inherited roles, unfinished experiences, all working faster than thought. Most of what we call choice is simply the tip of a decision made long ago. This is not a betrayal of logic. It's the condition of being human. He began noticing how in moments that required presence, he disappeared into old scripts. His tone softened in conflict even when it shouldn't. His mouth apologized while his eyes said no. And when he tried to explain it to himself, he couldn't, not really. The justifications came later, and they sounded smart, but deep down, he knew they weren't the truth. They were narratives sewn over something automatic. And this is where the shift begins, not with changing everything, but with admitting, I don't know why I keep doing this. And the moment that admission becomes real, a new space opens. A pause before the next reaction, a quiet moment where something different could emerge. Jung wrote that freedom doesn't begin when we break rules. It begins when we see the rules we never knew we were following, the ones that live inside us, the ones that whisper before we speak. And maybe, just maybe, if you can stay present in that pause, if you can breathe before repeating, you'll glimpse something radical. The possibility that this time you don't have to choose what was already chosen for you. What you don't remember controls you more than what you do. He wasn't thinking about his childhood. In fact, he avoided it. He thought it didn't matter anymore. But one afternoon, while standing in a grocery store, choosing between two identical brands of cereal, he felt a sudden sense of pressure, like he was being watched. No one was, but something in his body remembered. A voice, long gone, saying, "Pick the right one. Don't disappoint." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't traumatic in the way the world defines trauma, but it stayed. A father's silence, a mother's glance, a teacher's raised eyebrow, not abuse, not violence, just enough to plant a seed, a subtle imprint that said, if you don't get it right, you're wrong. That memory never made it to the surface. It stayed hidden, like a code behind the screen, shaping every future hesitation. Jung believed that what we repress doesn't vanish. It becomes law, unconscious law. It forms expectations, anxieties, rhythms of decision-making. And because it works below awareness, we think we're free when we're actually reenacting. Again and again, we're not avoiding pain. We're avoiding touching the reason for the pain. He sat later that day, holding the memory gently, as if it were a fragile artifact. It was a moment he had dismissed 1,000 times, a cold comment at dinner, a dismissal when he tried to speak, a forgotten birthday. Small things. But these were the moments that formed the emotional architecture of his inner world, the places where he began to doubt his worth, without ever realizing it. And now, remembering wasn't about blaming. It wasn't about rewriting history. It was about reclaiming choice. Because until we name the unseen memory, it keeps choosing for us. If you find yourself confused by your own overreactions, if you don't understand why you freeze, retreat, explain too much, disappear, it may not be about now. It may be about something you forgot, but your body didn't. The first time you said, "This is my decision," you were already following someone else's script. He used to think he chose everything himself: his degree, his partner, the city he moved to. But lately, a quiet unease had been building, not panic, just a kind of questioning hum beneath the surface. Why did all of it feel familiar, predictable? Not like fate, but like déjà vu. One evening, he sat in a cafe, watching people walk by, and it hit him. Did I ever really choose this path? Or did I just never question it? Jung often spoke of unconscious loyalty, the invisible contracts we make with those who shaped us. A son who becomes a doctor because his mother once said, "That's a respectable life." A daughter who avoids confrontation because her father only loved her when she smiled. These are not choices. These are inheritances, passed down not in blood, but in silence, expectation, subtle pressure. He remembered how he once proudly said, "I'm just like my father," thinking it was strength. But now he wondered, what if that strength wasn't mine? What if I've been living a life meant to protect someone else's image? There's no shame in realizing this, no need to collapse under the weight of it. But there is a shift, a crack in the certainty. And sometimes that's all it takes. He started tracing back his decisions, the jobs he said yes to without reflection, the relationships he stayed in because they looked good from the outside, the hobbies he gave up because they didn't make sense. One by one, he peeled them back like layers of borrowed identity. It wasn't a crisis. It was a quiet reckoning. If you've ever said, "I chose this," but felt strangely hollow inside, it might be worth asking, whose voice was speaking when you made that choice? Because freedom doesn't begin with doing something new. It begins with seeing what was never truly yours to begin with. Until you see the pattern, you are doomed to play it. He found himself here again, same type of conversation, same emotional exhaustion. A different name, a different face, but the same ending. He was tired, not just from people, but from himself. At first, he called it coincidence, then bad luck. Eventually, he laughed it off. I guess I attract these situations. But that laugh became thinner over the years. Less amused, more resigned. And one day, while replaying the latest conflict in his mind, he stopped mid-thought and whispered, "Why does this keep happening to me?" Jung taught that the unconscious doesn't forget what hasn't been resolved. It reenacts it, repeats it. It brings the same characters in different costumes until we see the invisible thread that ties them all together. He called it compulsion to repeat, a quiet force that lives in all of us, not to punish, but to complete something. The relationships you enter that echo your childhood. The jobs you choose that feel just like home, even if home was cold. The roles you slip into, even when you swore you'd never play them again. None of it is random, all of it is script. Written not with intention, but with memory. He thought he was evolving, but really, he was orbiting the same wound, trying to solve it with the same tools that once created it. The only way out wasn't forward, it was inward. And when he finally sat with that pain, not as a victim, but as a witness, something shifted. He didn't blame anymore. He didn't even grieve the past the same way. He simply saw it. And in that seeing, the repetition lost its grip. If you feel stuck in a loop, it doesn't mean you're failing. It might mean your psyche is begging for resolution. Ask yourself, what am I being asked to finally see? Because until you name the pattern, it will keep showing up. Like a shadow that only leaves once you turn toward the light. You're kind, but are you free? He had always been the good one, the helpful one, the calm, kind, understanding one. Friends came to him with their mess. He listened, he smiled. He never interrupted, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. But lately, something in him was shifting. A strange resentment crept in after conversations where he gave too much. He'd leave feeling hollow, his kindness feeling less like virtue, more like silence in disguise. Jung believed the shadow is not only what we hide, but also what we overdo to avoid what we hide. And in kindness, we often bury rage. In being nice, we exile our desire to say no, our wish to resist, our instinct to protect. When he started noticing his automatic yes, he began asking a deeper question. Why do I always make space for others, but not for myself? It wasn't that he didn't care. He did. Deeply. But his care had become a performance, a shield. Somewhere long ago he'd learned that to be accepted, he had to disappear. That saying what he really felt was dangerous. That being liked was safer than being whole. And so he gave. Endlessly. Until one day he heard himself laugh at a joke that wasn't funny, offer help he didn't mean, reassure someone when his own world was crumbling. And in that moment, he saw it. This wasn't kindness, it was fear, it was a survival strategy that had outlived its usefulness. Your kindness is not false, but it may not be free. Not until you've met the parts of you that are angry, tired, wild, and honest. The parts that don't want to comfort, but confront. Because true compassion includes you too. So ask yourself, who are you when you're not trying to be good? What truth hides behind your soft voice? And what happens when your kindness finally has a boundary? Not everything that pulls you closer is love. Sometimes it's your unfinished story. He met her in an ordinary moment. No drama. No grand introduction. Just a glance, and something in him locked onto her. It wasn't comfort. It was gravity. The kind that pulls you before you know you're moving. She wasn't safe. She wasn't particularly kind, but she made something wake up in him. Something old. Something unsettled. Conversations with her felt like déjà vu, arguments circled like loops, and still he couldn't let go. Not because it was love, but because it was familiar. Jung believed that we are drawn to what we need to resolve, not what is right, and often the person we can't stop thinking about is not our future, but our past, disguised. There's a strange magnetism in trauma, a silent choreography of two psyches reenacting what they never finished. The boy in him saw in her the shape of a wound he'd never been able to name. Her withdrawal mirrored the absence he'd grown up inside. Her intensity echoed the chaos he had normalized. It wasn't her he was chasing. It was a resolution that never came. We often say, I can't explain this attraction, and that's the point. It's not about logic. It's a psychic pattern repeating itself, hoping that this time it will end differently. But it doesn't. Not until you see the pattern. Not until you stop calling it fate and start calling it memory. So ask yourself, is this love? Or is this repetition? Do you feel seen or just activated? And would you still want them if they didn't awaken your oldest pain? Every time you say, I don't want to go there, you've already arrived. He scrolled past the message without opening it. Just the name triggered something in his chest. A tightness, a quiet anger, a heaviness. He told himself he was just busy. But he wasn't. He just didn't want to feel. Later that day, someone mentioned his father. He changed the subject. Another asked about a past relationship. He smiled and made a joke. These weren't accidents. These were shields. Carl Jung believed that resistance is not weakness. It's protection. It's the psyche saying, not yet, it still hurts here. But the deeper truth? Resistance is also a doorway. The things you avoid thinking about are often the exact places where your story got stuck. He began to notice it. The topics that made his throat tighten. The people he couldn't look in the eye. The moments in memory he replayed, but only halfway. It wasn't about pushing himself through pain. It was about pausing and asking, why does this part of me still flinch? because flinching is a sign of life, a place not yet healed. And awareness is the first step toward softening what has been held for too long. What if your discomfort is not an enemy, but a map? What if resistance is a sign of value, that something important happened here and it still echoes? So next time you say, "I don't want to talk about it," ask, is it because it doesn't matter, or because it matters too much? Freedom doesn't begin when you break free. It begins when you realize you are bound. He sat alone that evening, not in silence, but in something deeper. Clarity. A kind of inner stillness that didn't need to be filled. Not by noise, not by people, not even by answers. Just presence. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like fixing anything. He didn't feel broken. He had spent years trying to be free. From patterns, from fear, from expectations. But freedom never came from escape. It came, quietly, when he stopped pretending he was already free. Jung believed that the conscious mind is not the master of our lives. It is the narrator of a script it barely understands. True freedom, he said, begins when we integrate the unconscious, when we meet the parts of us we had buried, feared, or avoided, and not to defeat them, but to listen. All the decisions he thought he had made on his own weren't. They were echoes, reflexes, inherited rhythms. But now, something shifted. He didn't need to be perfect. He didn't even need to be certain. He just needed to be awake. Awake enough to pause before reacting. Awake enough to feel discomfort without hiding. Awake enough to ask, is this truly me or the past speaking through me? That night he stood by the window, not thinking, not planning, just breathing. And for the first time he whispered, not loudly, not triumphantly, but with quiet certainty, "I choose." And he knew, not every choice was truly his. But from this point on, at least some would be.